Greetings my curious bunch of bakers, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'll show you to create a weekly baking plan so you always have fresh bread on hand. So let's get in the kitchen and get started. It's the middle of the week, you're down to your last piece of bread and you don't have time to make bread until the weekend. Today's video will prevent this situation from happening ever again. I will show you a 7-day baking schedule which you can adjust to fit around your life. Here's how we're going to do it. On day 1, we'll mix the first dough and place it in the fridge to cold ferment for 3 days. On day 4, we'll remove that dough from the fridge and use it to make our first bread. On that same day, we'll mix another dough and place it in the fridge to ferment for another 3 days. During days 4, 5, 6 and perhaps 7, we will slowly eat up the first bread that we made. When we run out of bread on day 7, we will pull the ready fermented dough out of the fridge and make the following bread. And on the same day, we'll mix the next dough and leave it in the fridge. We can repeat this process indefinitely. You could work pretty much any bread into this schedule, and you can adjust certain things to bake more frequently. If you're a pizza or pita lover, for example, you can make a large batch of dough and pull a piece off of it every day. This video is only a guideline. Here are some things to consider for adjusting the baking schedule. The more yeast you use, the faster the dough is going to ferment. In my fridge, 1% to 0.7% is perfect for 24 to 48 hours of fermentation. 0.7% to 0.4% is good for 48 to 96 hours. Anything below 0.4% can go on for much longer. A dough that is larger and or has a higher hydration will ferment more rapidly, and fridge temperature is crucial. If you have tried any of my recipes from the cold fermentation playlist, you should already have a good idea of how much yeast you must use to ferment dough in your fridge. Use those recipes as a baseline and adjust from there. My fridge is usually around 5 degrees Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course it fluctuates. I open that fridge a dozen times a day, and I'm sure a lot of you do the same. Try to keep your dough in a cooler corner. Okay, let's have a look at the first sample recipe of this video. All 3 recipes in this video will be sliceable loaves. I imagine that most people who eat bread every day do it in sandwich form. The first recipe is made up of white bread flour, whole wheat bread flour, dark rye flour, salt, instant dry yeast, rye malt powder, caraway seed, dill seed, linseed and water. All the flour makes up 100% in Baker's percentage terms. There's 2% salt, 0.5% yeast, 5% rye malt powder, 1.2% caraway seed, 1.2% dill seed, 5% linseed and a hydration of 72%. We will get a nice flavorful batard out of this. And after I post this video, I will also post a dedicated video for this recipe. Okay, let's begin our week of baking. It's day 1, and this time I've kept it super simple. All we need to do is mix all the ingredients, pop the dough in the fridge and forget about it. I'm not even folding it. Whether you fold your dough or not, it's up to you. It has its benefits. You can watch a full video about it in the Principles of Baking playlist. If you're making a larger piece of dough, I would definitely suggest folding it just to equalize the temperature and cool it down sooner. Same goes for higher hydration dough, just to build some tension into it. Okay, the first dough has been mixed, the temperature is on point. It is 8:30 in the morning on Saturday. It's pretty wild that I recorded this video 4 months before I uploaded it. Right, let's get this baby in the fridge and leave it to chill there until day 4. If for any reason your dough is fermenting more rapidly than it should, just take it out and give it a fold. Okay, it's almost 7 PM on Tuesday. And that's day 4. Let's get that dough out of the fridge and make some bread. And while I'm doing that, another quick note on temperature control. As I mentioned earlier, fridge temperature is crucial. The warmer your fridge, the quicker your dough will ferment. The less yeast you must use. The temperature of the dough after you mix it is also extremely important. I've had quite a few people ask me about this when it comes to cold fermentation. Why do we care about the dough temperature if it's just going to sit in the fridge all cold for 3 days? The yeast must be at a certain temperature to get the fermentation going. If you use cold water and the final dough temperature is below 20 degrees Celsius or 68 Fahrenheit for example, it will have a very hard time fermenting. If the dough is already cool, after you place it in the fridge, it's gonna go cold very soon. In the best case, it's gonna mess with your schedule. In the worst case, it's not gonna ferment at all. If you are new to cold fermentation, I would highly suggest you check out my full cold fermentation guide, which you can find in the Principles of Baking playlist. This video right here is mainly for the baking schedule. You'll find more detailed information in the cold fermentation guide. But if you're already into cold fermentation and you're just looking for some recipes, then check out the cold fermentation playlist. It's full of them. By tweaking the amount of yeast, you could apply any of them to this baking schedule. Okay, the bread is ready, let's leave it to cool down. While it's cooling down, let's mix up the next dough. Like I mentioned earlier, you can use this method for any recipe. This time I decided to make a 50-50 sandwich loaf with equal amounts white flour and whole wheat flour, salt, instant dry yeast, olive oil and water. And that's 100% flour, 2% salt, 0.5% yeast, 3% olive oil and a hydration of 74%. This dough will get exactly the same treatment. We'll mix it up, we'll leave it in the fridge and we'll bake it 3 days later. The great thing about cold fermentation is that it's slow, so you don't need to stick to your schedule. If you don't have time or you still have bread, leave the dough in the fridge for another day, 2 or 3 even. And the same works the other way around. If you run out of bread, you can pull this dough out of the fridge sooner. There are 2 reasons for my chosen fermentation times and baking frequency. I would consume a medium-sized loaf like this in 3 to 4 days. If I eat a couple of slices of this per day, a few days later, it'll be gone. And if I kept it for more than 4 days, it'll become too stale. So I designed the schedule in a way that I wouldn't need to bake too often, whilst also always having fresh bread. Your requirements may be totally different. If you want to bake a larger loaf and only bake once a week, you can do that. Ferment your dough for 7 days. If you want a flatbread for dinner every night, make a large batch of dough and pull a piece off of it every single day. You can start doing that from day 2 and then watch and feel how it changes throughout the week. Same goes for pizza or some type of roll. As long as you have enough space in your fridge, it's all good. And what do you know? It is Friday, day number 7, and I've run out of bread. Luckily 3 days ago, I mixed up my 50-50 sandwich loaf dough. And so the cycle continues. I'm gonna make my sandwich loaf now, and I'm gonna mix another dough, leave it in the fridge to ferment until next time. A quick note on yeast. I always use instant dry yeast. It's just the most convenient option in my opinion. It never goes off, and it's always ready to be used. If you're using fresh yeast, I would suggest increasing the amount 3 times. If you're using active dry yeast, it's extremely important that you let the yeast sit in the water for 10 to 15 minutes before you add the other ingredients and mix your dough. If you don't do this, you might open your fridge in 3 or 4 days time and the dough might still look the same as when you put it in there. I know it's called active yeast, but that's a bit misleading. When it comes to salt, I usually go for 2%. The reason why I mention that specifically is because the amount of salt also affects fermentation. The more salt there is, the slower it will ferment. And there are certain ingredients that will speed up fermentation. If the dough contains a lot of whole grain flour or even freshly milled flour, it will ferment more rapidly. If it contains sugar, honey or some other sweetening at or below 3%, that will also speed up fermentation. Keep all these things in mind when you're choosing your recipes. Of course you don't need to worry too much about them. Even if your dough is under or over fermented, you can still make good bread with it. Learn from the mistake, adjust, and make it better next time. Let me know if you have a baking schedule. Tell me about it. I'll be curious to know. How frequently do you bake? And what type of bread is it? I can imagine that there could be an infinite number of different baking schedule and recipe combinations. And I only showed you a very basic example. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.